Hey,
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Nice to see you.
It's good to see you too.
Aw. Oh, yes. Hey, Genevieve. Oh, connecting. I always get ahead of the game.
Yeah.
I get too excited. I'm like, oh, name on the screen. Hey, Genevieve.
Maybe.
Have you been outside today, Nicole?
Yeah.
Stunning.
It's really nice.
Yeah. Hey.
Do you have cherry blossoms near you, Amy?
A few. So. Oh, hey, Stephen.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good.
Oh, nice
Hi,
to
Stephen.
meet you.
I'm Michelle with the National History Academy. Nice to meet you.
Hi there.
And I'm Nicole. I work with the National History Academy as well.
Nice to meet you.
Likewise, Amy. Yeah, I just know your name from Genevieve, so it's so nice to see you in person. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
Genevieve's
hosting us.
she's in another room, so she's gonna hop on in a few minutes. I do have my PowerPoint set up. If I can get screen share access, I can go ahead and get that up and make sure it plays okay.
Let's see. Okay, you should be able to share your screen.
All right. Let's see here. Okay. All right. Everybody can see that?
Yep.
Looks great.
All right, very nice.
Michelle, do you know if Bill will be available to do the introduction?
He is, yeah.
Okay, because Brent may have just lost internet.
Oh, yeah. Well, I copied him on the information and I spoke to him a few minutes ago, so he should be on.
Okay. So Stephen, just so you know, at the beginning, I'll be sharing my screen. It just has our introduction invite. And while that's sharing, I'm going to ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves so that I can set up Facebook Live. Either Brent or Bill, who I know Brent has worked with the Sixth Floor Museum before. I'm not sure if you would know him or Bill.
I don't think so.
All right, well, one of them will sort of introduce the program and then introduce you. And we essentially have Zoom set up to follow the speaker. So whoever is currently speaking is the person who will be on screen. So we just ask, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself, turn off your camera.
Okay.
So.
And as far as
Hi. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Sellers. I'm the president of National History Academy, and we're thrilled to have Stephen Fagin, the curator of the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas, with us today. And to tell you a little bit about National History Academy, we're a summer program for high school and middle school students. We were residential in 2018 and 2019, started in 2017, and went online last summer. We've just started our recruiting for this summer's courses, where we combine cases by the Case Method Institute through Harvard Business School professor David Moss, virtual site visits, a series of history workshops designed for high school students. And we encourage you to check out our website at nationalhistoryacademy.org. We've just started recruiting, so there's plenty of time to take a look. We've run these a series of virtual site visits over the course of the last 2 months that we plan on continuing on into the indefinite future. And recently we've been to the Oklahoma City Memorial and Oklahoma City, a number of other important sites, and we're thrilled to be at the 6th Floor Museum today. And to introduce our guests, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Brent Glass, the Executive Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. So Brent.
Thank you, Bill. And it's a great pleasure again to join the National History Academy in this virtual field trip, this time to the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, where I've been a guest on several occasions, and want to recognize the Executive Director, Nicola Longford, who has been a great friend over the years, and also a great supporter of the National History Academy. I think the National History Academy is doing some important work in history education, especially in providing access to historic sites throughout the country and recognizing the power of place in understanding American history. And I think our guests today will make that clear, and our visitors, I hope, will appreciate just how important the power of place is when you hear about the voices describing the events of November 22nd, 1963. And so I'm going to turn the program over to Stephen Fagin, who will guide us for the rest of our field trip. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's my great pleasure to be talking to you from Dallas, Texas. I'm going to share my screen so that I can pull up the PowerPoint here. All right, hopefully you'll all be able to see that skyline view of downtown Dallas, Texas, and you can probably easily pick out the Texas School Book Depository building. It's the only one in color in this particular view. And the title of this program is Voices: An Oral History of the Kennedy Assassination. And oral history is the most important thing I'm really going to be talking about today. It's a robust part of our collection at the museum. Our collection includes over 90,000 objects related to the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy and the history and culture of the 1960s. And I would say the Oral History Project, an ongoing initiative that we've been doing since we opened way back in 1989, is really key to understanding and interpreting this time period. I'm going to show you a picture here, if I can, of, I'm not able to advance my screen. There we go. All right, so there is our building, the Texas School Book Depository, which is actually the site of Dallas County government. It's the seat of local government. Back in the 1970s, there was a movement to tear down this building because of its dark association with this painful moment in American history. But fortunately, community leaders decided that it was better to be preserved. And so Dallas County stepped in and bought the building as part of a bond package in 1977, renovated the first 5 floors of this old 1901 warehouse space, and ultimately made it the seat of local government, specifically to make the Texas School Book Depository a useful part of the community, so that it was no longer this manifestation of evil staring out across Dealey Plaza with these vacant and accusing eyes. It took a long time, about 12 years of controversial development for our museum to come together. We opened in 1989, and we occupy the 6th floor here, that's our core exhibit that tells the story of President Kennedy's time in the White House in the early 1960s, the assassination, the aftermath. And then we expanded to the 7th floor in 2002. And this 7th floor gallery enables us to have in-house and traveling temporary exhibits. It's also a great space for education and public programming as well. So we occupy the 6th and the 7th floors of the School Book Depository. Down here on the ground floor, currently not open, but we do have a wonderful research center overlooking Dealey Plaza called the Reading Room. And that is open typically in non-pandemic times to students, teachers, researchers, and the general public, a great free resource to access our library, our digital collections, and the entirety of our oral history project. And speaking of our oral history project, this is something near and dear to my heart. I've been at the museum now for 21 years, and I started working on the oral history project the day I got here. And I now have the great honor of overseeing that program. We've interviewed close to 2,000 people about their memories of the assassination, individual recorded conversations, just like the one you see pictured here. And our project has kind of expanded and grown over time, not just in quantity of interviews, but in the subject matter as well. We began way back in 1989 collecting oral histories specifically with folks who had direct connections to the Kennedy assassination story, eyewitnesses, police officers, Secret Service agents, folks like that. But it has grown to really encompass the cultural history of the 1960s. In fact, I have this slide I'll put up here now that is going to flash 25 different thematic categories. There will not be a quiz on this at the end, but it hopefully, as these things kind of fly by, hopefully gives you a sense of the broad scope of this project. It includes programs like the Peace Corps and the space race of the 1960s, the history and culture of the time. It includes, of course, the civil rights movement. We've interviewed Vietnam veterans and demonstrators, peace movement activists as well, people who were inspired by the legacy of President Kennedy, as well as those who vividly recall his presidency and, of course, his death here in Dealey Plaza and the national and global impact that assassination had. Our website, really easy to remember, jfk.org, has this kind of launch page for the Oral History Project. There's a short video, which is what you see in the center of the screen there. And it's a little tricky to navigate, but over here on the left, you'll see an Interviews by Name button, which actually takes you to an alphabetized list of all participants, all nearly 2,000 participants in the Oral History Project, many of them who have recordings on YouTube, including Brent Glass. You can click on the name and it'll immediately take you to their interview or program recording on our YouTube channel. And over here is the thematic categories list. It's a drop-down menu with those 25 categories that you saw a moment ago. And it will take you to a list of people specifically related to those various topics. So with that kind of context in mind, the Oral History Project, what this program is, Voices, is an opportunity for me to sort of be your narrator as we walk through the experience of the Kennedy assassination through the first-person perspectives of those who lived it. And we're going to start that morning, the morning of November 22nd, when President Kennedy was in Fort Worth at the Hotel Texas. And the first speaker we're going to hear from, the first voice in our journey today, is Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth. And I will try to point out these historical figures in these photographs as we discuss. There's Jim Wright right there next to John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy, the morning of the assassination, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. That morning, Congressman Wright had arranged for a kind of impromptu speech in the parking lot of the Hotel Texas for President Kennedy. The weather that morning was not cooperating, as he explains in his oral history. So I'm going to periodically drift into the voices of these various storytellers today. About 15 minutes before he was scheduled to appear, I looked out and people were already gathering in rain gear, many of them with umbrellas. And I thought, oh, what a mess. He's got to get up there and speak to that crowd in the rain. But then just a few minutes before we went out there, the clouds disappeared. The sun came through, a bright, beautiful, sun-shining day. The rain had disappeared, and I thought, well, that's the luck of the Irish. For Jim Wright, this was a wonderful occasion. As he explains, I can't tell you how happy I was to have the President of the United States in my hometown talking to my folks. I was just overcome with joy. Gosh, in those days, it was rare when a President of the United States visited your hometown. There hadn't been a sitting president in Fort Worth since 1936, when Franklin Roosevelt took a ride down Main Street in an open touring car, and I was there as a boy. Now, among that enthusiastic crowd waiting outside the Hotel Texas for a glimpse of President Kennedy was this young man perched high atop the crowd there. That young boy went on to have a prosperous career in Hollywood. He has since passed away, but that is actor Bill Paxton, who you might recognize his face from a number of movies in the 90s like Apollo 13, Twister, and especially Titanic. He remembers, when the president came out, it was like seeing a real leading man, movie star. He seemed tan and very jocular. I remember his opening comment was something to the effect that he was sorry that Jackie wasn't out there, but she takes a little bit longer to get ready, but then she looks a lot better too. Now, my dad had a dilemma. He was trying to take turns putting my brother Bob, who was 11, and myself at age 8, up on his shoulders, and he was getting kind of worn out by all the exercise. And there were these two African-American men standing next to us, just strangers like all of us were in that crowd. They saw my dad's predicament, and they said, hey, we'll take those boys. So I can remember sitting up on this stranger's shoulders, listening to the president as he spoke. And it was a very exciting moment. You could just feel there was electricity in the air. So after that rally out in front of the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth, there was a breakfast in the hotel ballroom. And then the Kennedys made their way by motorcade, as you see here, to Carswell Air Force Base for this very short flight to Dallas Love Field. Now, crowds were lining the streets in Fort Worth as the Kennedys traveled from the hotel to Carswell, including a man named Horace Craig. My family went out there on the way to Carswell, and there were people all along the route already holding up signs and waving American flags. There had been articles in the newspaper about how much President Kennedy enjoyed his rocking chair. And so I remember one whole family was sitting by the side of the road, just lined up, rocking in rocking chairs. It was sort of a festive occasion. Now, meanwhile, crowds were beginning to gather at Dallas Love Field to greet the president upon his arrival. George Reed, who is circled right here in this photograph, had been a Kennedy campaign volunteer in 1960, and he got to the airport quite early so he could be right up against the fence. He remembers everybody just looked as happy as they could be. There were just 2 or 3 people there that had anti-Kennedy signs. I remember seeing some students there waving a big Confederate flag. But you know, that crowd, there was really a mob out there at Love Field. Jim Ewell, a reporter with the Dallas Morning News, was also there, and he remembers, what impressed me was the turnout of people, a lot of school kids I remember. And just when Air Force One was sighted over Love Field, the clouds broke, the sun shone through, and by the time that plane was on the ground, it was a beautiful day. I'll always remember that the morning of November 22nd really turned out to be a gorgeous day, and it was so fitting that it matched up with the president's arrival in Dallas. Now, Rosemarie Simmons was a student at W.W. Samuels High School in Dallas, and she was among that crowd of nearly 4,000 people. She remembers, my sister and I were standing right there at the fence. One of the most impressive things were the 2 huge planes that landed with United States of America printed on the side. It was overwhelming to see the official planes of the president, including Air Force One. I mean, that was almost the thrill of the day right there. And then suddenly the Kennedys got off the plane. Back to reporter Jim Ewell. There was, of course, the excitement, of seeing Jacqueline, the First Lady, as she stepped off the plane. And we all remember that pink suit and everything else. I remember that the wife of the Dallas mayor, Earl Cabell, handed the First Lady a bouquet of red roses that was a gesture of the goodwill of the people of Dallas. And again, to campaign volunteer George Reed, when they got off the plane, I saw them. Both of them looked really alive, really into things. The president was well-groomed. He looked neat, clean, and well-tailored. Helen Holmes was an executive with the Sam Bloom advertising agency in Dallas, and she had been part of the team that coordinated PR for the Kennedy visit. And she noticed the First Lady in particular. Jackie was dressed in that famous pink suit and had a pink pillbox sort of perched on the back of her hair. And she was smiling, and she smiled constantly through the whole thing. And suddenly she and the president went over to the people on the fence and started shaking hands. Back to reporter Jim Ewell. At first, it looked like they were going to go and get right in the motorcade, but I guess the president was so taken with the turnout of school kids especially, that he marched over to the fence, which just thrilled everyone. And they were reaching across, everybody was reaching across. And of course, that put the Secret Service into a real nervous frenzy. Now, for W.W. Samuels High School student Rose Marie Simmons that we met a moment ago, this was the moment of a lifetime. And here is Rose Marie in that crowd of people that day. This is her story. There was just a high-pitched excitement that everyone was feeling. Oh, and I got to shake his hand. The day before, I had told my 11th grade American history teacher, Ms. Rose Callahan, that I was going to go down to see Kennedy at Love Field. And she said, well, you have to bring a note from the president if you want to be excused from my class. I mean, of course, it was excused with a note from your parents, but that idea made me decide to ask him for an autograph. And so when I shook his hand, I quickly asked him for an autograph to give to my history teacher. And he replied in his Boston accent, there's too many people. If I wrote one for you, I'd have to sign one for everyone. But he quickly assured me as he passed by that if I wrote to his secretary, whose name was Evelyn Lincoln, that she would send me an autographed picture. Now, after the assassination, my history teacher encouraged me to write to Miss Lincoln because, as a 16-year-old, I doubt I would have followed through. I don't know if I really expected anything back. And I was very surprised when I received an envelope from the White House a few months later with a letter and an autographed picture of President Kennedy. And here is Rose Marie during one of our programs before she passed away, showing that letter that she received from Miss Lincoln. The letter is so genuine, you can tell that it really touched her, that shortly before the assassination, President Kennedy mentioned her by name. The letter read, Dear Marie, your letter touched me very much since you said the late president told you to write to me for a picture. That reference to me could not have been too long before the fatal shot. Therefore, I will always treasure your letter. It is a pleasure to send you this picture. President Kennedy appreciated your interest, I'm sure. Sincerely, Evelyn Lincoln, personal secretary to the late President John F. Kennedy. As the Kennedys left the fence line, local cameraman Malcolm Couch made this poignant observation. Kennedy went over to the motorcade, over to that convertible, and he sat down. Jackie got in, they both sat down. I'll never forget thinking later on, reflecting back, he never got up again. Once he sat down, that was it. Along the motorcade route, Dallasites welcomed President and Mrs. Kennedy to their city. Among them was a woman named Nancy Cheney, who remembers, here came the motorcade down Lemon Avenue. We were standing right there at the curb. And when they got to us, the car completely stopped for a moment. I told my daughter Allison to throw the president a kiss. Well, we were so close that he actually was able to reach up and pat her on the cheek. And he said something like, hi, baby. That just thrilled us both to death. And so after they passed, we got in the car and I said, let's go tell Daddy and everybody at the office that the President of the United States spoke to you today. On board one of the press buses in the motorcade was Robert McNeil, who at that time was a White House correspondent for NBC. And he recalls, we went towards Dallas and it was very warm on the bus. I don't think the air conditioning was on. I began to get sleepy, and I'm sort of half daydreaming. And in this sort of daydream, I actually thought, what if somebody took a shot at Kennedy because of the political atmosphere in Dallas? What would I do? Well, I guess I'd stop the bus and get out and see what happened. But then I shook myself and said, hey, come on, don't be crazy. Go back to being a reporter. With a bird's eye view of the motorcade as it made its way down the canyon of Main Street, was Glenn Gatlin, a young executive with a Dallas brokerage firm. We'd all been looking forward to the president's visit, and officing in the Mercantile Continental building, we had a very good view of the parade route. We were up on the 12th floor, and so we were watching the street and saw the crowd below begin to get more and more active. The crowds were enthusiastic, waving. It was just one of the best of times. You had a feeling that you were part of an important national event, something that might even be a little bit historic. We had a very good view of the president and everyone else until they disappeared around the corner. It's true that the motorcade was an immediate success. More than 200,000 people gathered on the downtown streets to greet the president. As the limousine made the turn that you're seeing right here from Main Street onto Houston, as they approached that fateful turn onto Elm in Dealey Plaza, the official parade was winding down. Dealey Plaza was the end of the parade route. Dallas Morning News chief photographer Tom Dillard was in one of several press cars traveling behind the presidential limousine. And Tom remembers that instant of 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. We were relaxed. We said, boy, it went great. You know, no problems, thank God. We were sitting, chatting, just talking. The car was stopped while we were on Houston. And incidentally, it had turned cool. The wind was coming from out of the north, and it was quiet, clear, and cool. And so when this gun went off, it was loud. And I said, they're throwing torpedoes at him. I was thinking in my mind, you know, those things that we would throw as kids that would hit the sidewalk and explode. But then in a matter of a second and a half, another shot. And I said, no, that's rifle fire. Standing along Elm Street, Ann Atterbury was witnessing the assassination with a group of coworkers, standing there on her lunch break. He kind of pushed his hair out of his face and he smiled and waved at what I thought was personally at me. They started on down the hill. And then I heard a loud noise and I thought at first it might be a car backfiring, firecrackers maybe. And I looked up at the tall buildings because that's where it sounded like it came from, behind me and up by Dealey Plaza. I turned back to the car. I heard two more shots and I saw him fall. This young family, a local electrician named Bill Newman, along with his wife Gail and their two young sons, Billy and Clayton, became the closest eyewitnesses to President Kennedy at the moment of the fatal shot. And Bill will never forget those awful moments. We were on the curb's edge and the president's car was out one lane from the curb. And I can remember hearing a boom, boom, about like that. And I thought somebody had thrown a couple of firecrackers or something beside the president's car. I can remember the thought, you know, that's a pretty poor joke, somebody doing something like that. And the president, his hands came up. He just kind of threw his arms up and kind of raised up in his seat. As the president got straight out in front of us, I can remember seeing a flash of white. And he went across the car seat into Mrs. Kennedy's lap. And I turned to Gail and I said, that's it, hit the ground. Now, meanwhile, back in the motorcade press buses, Robert McNeil of NBC is reacting to the shooting. I got up and I grabbed the bus driver's hand and I said, stop the bus, open the door. And he opened the door and I got out. The air was filled with the most unbelievable sound. It was the screaming of thousands of people, all different pitches of voices and everything. It's as though 30 choirs had all gone berserk and were screaming out of pitch. And I knew that something awful had happened. Along Elm Street, Ann Atterbury was in shock at what she had just witnessed. Suddenly, I saw people hitting the ground. My roommate, Mary Elizabeth, said, they killed him. And I kept saying, oh, I hope not, surely. This is all just a bad dream. And the traffic was gridlocked. Somebody leaned out a car window and caught my eye and said, what is going on? And I was in tears by this point, and I just said, the president's been shot. And it was just such an unlikely thing to say. The man said, the president of what? And I said, the president of the United States. And I burst into tears again. Just 6 minutes after the shooting, the presidential limousine with the wounded and the dying arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Dr. Jim Carrico, a resident in general surgery, was the first one on the scene. Kennedy still had a heartbeat, but he had a terrible looking wound. The thoughts that I remember were, the president's not going to make it. And that proved to be right. But the second one was, we've got to do something. You see, these were the political and the medical thoughts. You know, we just can't let the president die. Other doctors, including Dr. Robert McClellan, began approaching this room, trauma room number 1 in the Parkland Emergency Center, where the president was being treated at that time. Dr. McClellan remembers, the crowd parted enough that I saw Mrs. Kennedy sitting there on a chair in that famous pink suit. And I thought, oh my God, here I was, a 34-year-old instructor in surgery. And I had to almost force myself not to turn around and run and to keep going back towards that room. And Doris Nelson, who was the head nurse in there, she was telling the Secret Service who to let by. And she saw me and said, let him in, he's one of the doctors. And I went on into the room. Despite their best efforts to save President Kennedy, he was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. And slowly the doctors filed out of the trauma room. Dr. Carrico, the first one who had seen the president upon his arrival, remembers, all the emergency patients were gone when I walked out of trauma room 1. They had been moved elsewhere in the hospital. The people in that room were by and large men with coats off, shirts and ties on, and guns strapped to their hips. And a couple of them were on the phone talking to Washington. That's when the whole thing hit me, you know. Up until then, it had been professional work. But when I got out there, I realized that not only had my little world changed, the whole world had changed. Outside the Parkland emergency room, bystanders and dignitaries from the motorcade and reporters wandered around, some of them crying, others just staring off into space. They were all awaiting news of the president's condition. Among that group was an unlikely journalist, Tony Zoppi, who was the Dallas Morning News nightclub reporter. He remembers, I was stuck outside and I was totally frustrated. About that time, an O'Neill Funeral Home ambulance pulled up carrying this huge bronze casket. And I thought to myself, my God, he's dead. Nobody knew whether he was alive or dead at this point. There had been a lot of speculation, but when I saw that casket, I knew. I'm going to circle Tony Zoppi there. There you see him in this photograph. The driver and his helper got out of the ambulance and they turned to me and another guy and said, would you grab a corner? And so we helped lift up this casket. I got inside and I quickly got to a telephone as fast as I could. And I got through to the Dallas Morning News. City editor, my boss, John King, answered the phone. And I just said, the president is dead. Now, he had all his top reporters out there in the field. And here I am, the nightclub reporter. So his first reaction was, how do you know? And I said, because I just carried in his casket. The task of officially announcing the death of President Kennedy fell to the man in this picture right here, Assistant White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff. And he remembers, when it became apparent to me that the president was dead, I went across the hall over to Vice President Lyndon Johnson. I suddenly realized I didn't know what to call him. Situation de facto, he had now become the president. So I stood there for a moment and I just said, Mr. President, and his wife Lady Bird let out a scream. Shortly thereafter, after President Johnson and his wife left the hospital, Kilduff made the announcement as you see here, surrounded by reporters. Outside, individuals heard the news coming across car and portable radios. The response was deeply emotional, almost as if a family member had died. Dallas housewife Virginia Gatlin remembers how important the radio was to her that afternoon. I listened to the radio a lot I kept music on all the time. And what was interesting to me was flipping the dial. Stations that you didn't even know had classical music in their music libraries had suddenly pulled out the quietest, the most solemn things, and that's all they were playing that day. The country western stations had all gone over to gospel hymns. And to me, that was the most poignant and significant impact of all, was what you heard and what you didn't hear. That told me. You see, these things were my touchstones. Nothing I was hearing that day was like anything I had ever heard before. Everything had changed. Now, meanwhile, back in Dealey Plaza, law enforcement officials are concentrating their search for the assassin or assassins inside this building, the Texas School Book Depository. Deputy Sheriff Luke Mooney, and there is Luke circled in this picture here, was the first one on the 6th floor of that warehouse. And he remembers, you could see over the tops of the boxes. And I said, well, I'll go over to that southeast corner. So I just started winding my way through some channels, little old aisles. I walked all around, squeezed through, and I came across this area. I saw that the window was partially open, and I saw this box of books in the window, and there was a crease in them where the rifle had apparently been laid. And down there on the ground, you couldn't miss them, were these 3 empty rifle shells. The Dallas Police Crime Scene Search Unit soon arrived on the scene, and the man in charge of gathering evidence inside the School Book Depository is the man you see on the screen here, Lieutenant Carl Day of the Dallas Police Department. We picked those shells up, put a little fingerprint dust on them. They didn't show any prints on them, which is not unusual. It's kind of hard to put fingerprints on rifle shells like that. About 10 minutes after we found the sniper's perch in the southeast corner, some men working with the sheriff's department found a rifle over in the northwest corner of the floor. Now, while this was taking place, over in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, depository employee Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested inside this movie theater, the Texas Theater on Jefferson Boulevard in Oak Cliff. At the time of his arrest, Oswald was the prime suspect in the nearby shooting of a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippett. A shoe store manager had seen Oswald enter the theater acting suspiciously without buying a ticket, and the police were called. And from the theater's stage, he pointed out Oswald to police officers. Detective Paul Bentley observed what happened next when Dallas police officer Nick McDonald approached Oswald inside the theater. I had only taken a few steps in the theater when I saw Officer McDonald come up to the row right in front of the suspect. And just as McDonald came up to him, Oswald jumped up and he hit McDonald in the face, which knocked his cap off and knocked McDonald back a little bit. I came flying over the backs of the seats, and I actually hung my right ankle in between seats, scuffling with Oswald, trying to get him under control. During all this, I pulled a muscle in my right ankle, but I wasn't even aware of it at the time. We handcuffed Oswald, and he turned to me and complained immediately that the handcuffs were too tight as we started walking out of the theater. Very quickly, over 300 members of the world press descended upon Dallas Police Headquarters, and it was a situation that officers there were unprepared to deal with. Homicide Detective Elmer Boyd, the man on the right in this photograph, was one of the law enforcement officials assigned to handle Oswald on Friday. And he spent time with him during his interrogations and escorting him through those crowded corridors at Dallas Police Headquarters. And he remembers Oswald wasn't a dummy by any means. You would ask him a question and he'd give you an answer. I felt it might not be the right one that he'd give you, but he was willing to talk about his trip to Russia, where he met his wife, Marina. I mean, he really talked about everything except when it got to Officer Tippett or President Kennedy. All he kept saying over and over again, I haven't shot anybody. I haven't shot anybody. And of course, moving beyond November 22nd, Oswald himself was shot and killed on live television by a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby on Sunday, November 24th, as Oswald was being transferred from the Dallas City Jail to the Dallas County Jail in Dealey Plaza. That sudden shooting of the alleged assassin ensured that lingering questions would always remain about the Kennedy assassination, so that here we are at this point, nearly 60 years after this event. Researchers, authors, historians, documentarians, they continue to question Oswald's motivations and wonder whether or not a conspiracy may have occurred. But it's important to remember that the assassination galvanized the world in a manner not witnessed until September 11th, 2001. Grief and anger were expressed regardless of political affiliations and personal beliefs. One African-American high school student, Bob Ray Sanders, remembers how that day's excitement suddenly turned into unimaginable sorrow. My marching band was practicing our homecoming and Thanksgiving program when we got the news. And we paid no attention at first when someone came running down the hill yelling out that Kennedy had been shot. We just dismissed it. But as we started walking up those long stairs to get back to the main campus to go to lunch, I mean, it was chaos. People were fainting, crying, screaming. Ambulances had actually come to the school to pick up those kids who had fainted. The principal came on and said, "Teachers, turn off your television sets and radios. This situation is just too chaotic." But needless to say, no one did. They turned them up. It was just an amazing moment. And for people like me who had grown up living in segregation, to hear that John Kennedy had been killed, I mean, as far as I was concerned, hope had been assassinated that day. He was our hope. These emotions of grief, confusion, and sadness, they weren't just limited to the young. Glenn Gatlin, who we met earlier as he watched the motorcade go down Main Street, watching from his 12th floor office window, this is what he describes that afternoon and evening. "It was almost like one of the Tolkien novels, as if a dark spirit had just descended on the community. Amazing rumors began to fly. It was a very hard day in Dallas life." The rest of that afternoon, we were listening to the radio. Those of us who had television sets were turning them on, but nobody had any real answers to all the questions that were coming up, and it had a depressing effect on the entire community. And it didn't take long for Dealey Plaza to be transformed into a shrine, as floral arrangements and note cards suddenly peppered the grass on either side of Elm Street. A New York radio reporter named Ike Pappas visited the plaza that weekend. This is what he remembers. "I was going to do a 2 or 3 minute mood piece for radio. And when I got there, the whole place was covered with these wreaths and cards and flowers. I said, 'My God, look at this.' I was amazed. I picked one up, and it was from a Boy Scout, from a certain Boy Scout troop. And it said, 'To my president, we know you're now with God and happy, from Billy.' And another one said, 'You are our father and we love you, President Kennedy.' I mean, I was just overcome by this. And I turned on my tape recorder and I walked through this field of memories and I read them. Here's another one and here's another one. It was a very emotional, kind of wonderful, sad piece on the radio. And maybe it's contradictory to say wonderful and sad, but that's the way it was." In describing the power of Dealey Plaza as a historic site and a place of curiosity and mourning, I really think an author and a researcher named Josiah Thompson put it best in his oral history. "That's the oddity of this place. It seems so banal. The concrete pergola from a WPA project, the curve downhill towards the freeway, the railroad overpass, the depository building, all of these totally banal city structures in the crucible of this event gain a kind of symbolic significance. It all happened here, and yet all one has here is banality, concrete, grass, bricks." In the decades following the assassination of President Kennedy, Dealey Plaza has become an important space for social activism and peaceful protest. In the 1960s, as you see here in this picture, many protests, both in favor and against the Vietnam War, took place. More recently, Dealey Plaza has been the site of rallies on issues such as racial discrimination, immigration, foreign policy, and economic inequality. The words and the image of the slain president, often used to fuel these community dialogues, It prompts many individuals to find in Dealey Plaza a very powerful emotional link to the unfulfilled promise and legacy of the Kennedy era. In 1993, Dealey Plaza was named a National Historic Landmark District, and this is a picture of that dedication ceremony from the 30th anniversary of the assassination. And it kind of brings us full circle where we began today. It demonstrates this ongoing relevance and this interest in the site by people and the way it fuels social activism and community exchanges. I mean, it really demonstrates that there's more to the story of the Kennedy assassination than conspiracy theories and whodunit conjecture. The life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy remains with us well over half a century later. And our museum continues to collect new voices to better help us remember and understand the past. So that is my walk through the assassination today. I hope that maybe you learned something or at least saw a picture or two that maybe you hadn't seen before from our collection. And I wanted to leave some time at the end, about 20 minutes or so we can go through some questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful tour and narration. We so appreciate all of the stories and being able to hear and learn so much about the Sixth Floor Museum. We do have a couple of questions, and I wonder if you might be able to start us off with, what are some of the objects at the Sixth Floor Museum that maybe you'd like to highlight for us, something that we would see if we were in person?
Sure. Yeah. If you visited the museum today, you would be able to see some interesting artifacts directly connected to the assassination. We have a section that details the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald, and you may have seen, I don't have it handy, but there is a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph showing that moment of agony as Oswald is shot and killed. It's a powerful, iconic image taken by a local Dallas photographer. And we have essentially brought that photograph to life. We have the suit of clothes, the white suit, a tan colored suit that the homicide detective Jim Lavelle was wearing at that moment as he's kind of turned in that picture, trying to move Oswald out of the way as Jack Ruby sticks a gun in Oswald's gut, firing that shot. And next to it, we also have the pair of handcuffs that connected Detective Lavelle to Lee Harvey Oswald. And then right next to that, we have the famous gray fedora that Jack Ruby was wearing at the time he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. That hat, which, I mean, for millions of Americans watching on TV, that hat was the first they knew of Jack Ruby. He was the man in that hat that jumped out on live television and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. One of the most shocking moments ever broadcast live on television in this country or anywhere in the world, I would imagine. One of my favorite artifacts is one of our smallest on display. It's actually Lee Harvey Oswald's wedding ring. And the reason I like this artifact so much is because people have read into it so much symbolic significance. Oswald was estranged from his wife, Marina, at the time of the assassination. So they were living apart. But in an effort to try to get Marina to move back in with him, he had spent the night before the assassination with her, trying over and over again to try and convince Marina to move back in. And she refused. And so Oswald went to bed that night very upset. And the next morning he got up, made himself a cup of coffee and left the house, told Marina to stay in bed, left the house with a package wrapped in brown paper that authorities later concluded held the Mannlicher Carcano rifle found here in the Texas School Book Depository. But what Oswald did was he left his wedding ring in a little teacup on Marina's nightstand. And you can read into that what you want. He put next to the teacup some money, most of the couple's savings. And so for a lot of researchers, I mean, they read into this act, this man taking off his wedding ring really for the first time and putting it in this cup, the act of a man who knows he can never go home again. And so they see this little band of gold as the Rosetta Stone to kind of understand Oswald's mindset the morning of the assassination. And so for me, it's really interesting. I mean, to have that on the 6th floor, it's actually within sight of the southeast corner sniper's perch. And so if you do believe in the significance of the ring, if you want to assign some significance to it, I mean, it's almost like there's the key and there's the lock and they're within sight of each other there on the 6th floor of the School Book Depository. So those are a couple of the artifacts that, I mean, I think tell the best stories in the museum right now.
Thank you. Well, following along those lines, is there one person or a group of people in particular that work to preserve the space and to create the museum and then to garner those artifacts?
Absolutely. I mean, it really goes back to when Dallas County bought the building in the 1970s. The public works director who kind of fueled that plan conceived this rather strange notion of locating the seat of local government in a building associated with a presidential assassination. I mean, he recognized that Dallas County government would never want to have a conference room in the sniper's perch or somebody's office in the sniper's perch. He recognized that with 1 million people coming to Dealey Plaza every year, there needed to be some historical context, an exhibition provided that would not embarrass Dallas, but would educate people about what took place there. And so he turned to these two ladies, a local preservation activist named Lyndalyn Adams and a historian from Virginia named Conover Hunt. And really it was those two ladies over the course of 12 controversial years that spearheaded this project against all odds. Even when fundraising had to be stopped because President Reagan was shot in 1981 by a boy who grew up in Dallas and had books on Lee Harvey Oswald, even though it was considered inappropriate to have a museum in the aftermath of the Reagan shooting, even after an arson attempt on the building in 1984. I mean, they stuck with the project and pushed it through and did fundraising, even though it was locally unpopular. And nationally, there was an attitude that Dallas should pay for this. So there was kind of a discrepancy in terms of who was willing to support an exhibition inside the School Book Depository. But these two ladies, Lyndalyn Adams and Conover Hunt, are really the two, more than anyone else, who I would credit for making that museum a reality in 1989. And then from there, we've grown and expanded. And today, Dealey Plaza is considered the Dealey Plaza itself is considered, I think, the second most visited historic site in Texas behind the Alamo.
Wow. Thank you. I have one more question related to the building itself and just going back to that time. I know it was a textbook deposit or repository. Was the room being used or the building being used and general access was pretty easy to get into, and just kind of framing the building's use leading up to the assassination and the use of that particular room in the sniper's perch, et cetera?
Yeah, very good question. So the Texas School Book Depository is just as the name implies. It was really a distribution hub for school textbooks for all across North Texas and the surrounding states as well. So the first 4 floors of the building were regional offices for different educational publishers like Macmillan and McGraw-Hill and Scott Sforzman, some of the same publishers that publish textbooks today, almost 60 years later. They had offices in the building. And then 5, 6, and 7 were open storage for these school textbooks. And so employees like Oswald was an order filler making $1.25 an hour. They were able to go to those floors with a clipboard and, they'd have an order for a certain number of boxes of math books or science books. Oswald worked a lot on the 6th floor. They'd get those boxes, take them down on the freight elevator and load them up to go off to these schools. There wasn't any building security per se, but of course, there was a lot of people in the building, both warehouse workers, depository administration, and regional publishing folks. And so, I mean, the likelihood of somebody completely unconnected with the building being able to get up to the 6th floor is fairly unlikely, although there are theories along those lines. But certainly Oswald had access to the 6th floor on a daily basis. And in fact, his clipboard was found on the 6th floor a couple weeks after the assassination. It was just discovered, and it had his orders for November 22nd, 1963, and none of them had been filled.
Wow. All right. Thank you. That question came to us from Glenn Morgan. And we have another question from Arden Billings, who says, how much, if at all, did the museum at Ford's Theater influence the direction of the 6th floor museum? Did it give you an indication of what should be preserved or what would garner interest?
Yeah, it's another great question. Absolutely. Ford's Theater is thanked in our credits panel on the 6th floor, if it dates back to '89. Judson Shook, who was the public works director for Dallas County, he went with Lyndalyn Adams to Ford's Theater. They toured, they talked to the curator and director there, and really got a sense of how do you interpret a tragedy like this at the site of that violent act. It was very difficult because there were accusations early on that, well, if it's inside the school book depository, it's got to be a shrine or some sort of glorification of Lee Harvey Oswald. It can't be anything connected to President Kennedy because he never set foot in the building, didn't know the depository existed. And so there were arguments like that early on, that just by being in the depository, there would somehow be this glorification of the accused assassin. And so they were very sensitive to that. And they studied how Ford's Theater operated. They went to DC on one occasion in the hopes of getting the Texas School Book Depository added to the National Register of Historic Places. And essentially the depository was rejected out of hand. There was this belief. The National Park Service echoed this, that at that time, at least, they did not consider the Texas School Book Depository a building of historical significance that was worthy of preservation. And so it really did come down to the local level. This building very likely would have been demolished if it weren't for those folks in Dallas County government, the mayor at that time, Wes Wise, who had covered the assassination as a reporter, and the public works director, who stepped up and said, you know, we need to save this building, in part because they felt like if it was torn down, Dallas would be admitting some guilt. Dallas would be admitting that they were somehow culpable in the assassination. They were very sensitive to that as well.
We have a lot of questions. We have another one from, or a question from Keith Weib. How are you able to authenticate some of the artifacts as you are able to collect them and to garner them?
That's a good question too. I mean, obviously we're very careful because there's all sorts of things out there that I've come across so many copies of the exact same photograph offered to me by a person who claims their grandfather took this picture. And so we have a photograph with 17 grandfathers who claim ownership of this particular photograph. So we have to be, you know, careful with provenance, obviously. And so anytime, particularly an artifact with a direct connection to the assassination, I mean, it's always good to try and get an oral history with a donor, to try and get the context of that object. In a lot of cases, we have oral histories with people who directly worked with that artifact, like a camera, or we did an oral history with a Ford company executive who actually was able to keep this lap robe, this sort of blanket that was attached to the door of the presidential limousine. The Kennedy limousine, like really, if I can use modern terminology, a really tricked out ride. It was a customized limousine with a hydraulic lift for the president so he could raise and lower the back seat. It also had these wonderful little built-in blankets in the doors that could be removed so that the president and his guests, first lady, whoever, could cover themselves up in cold weather. They weren't used on the day of the assassination, but they were in the car. And when that car was stripped down to its metal frame and reconstructed at Ford and put back into presidential service, incidentally, that lap robe, that blanket, is one of the last remaining true artifacts from inside the limousine. And so we were able to document that and learn its entire backstory from the Ford Motor Company executive who was able to keep it. So it's a combination of documentation and also oral history recollections that help us provide provenance for some of these remarkable artifacts.
Shifting just a little bit, we have several questions that are related that I'll tie together. Ben Q is asking, how does the museum deal with the possibility of multiple shooters? And we also have a question about how does the museum respond to conspiracy theories?
Okay, yeah, those are good, very related questions. When the museum was put together in the began to be developed in the early 1980s, the founders went to both sides of the research spectrum. I mean, they went to academic historians at Southern Methodist University, and then they went to amateur assassination researchers and authors who were studying this case in their garages at that time and keeping up with each other through underground newsletters and things like that. So they really sought a wide variety, some 27 consultants on the content of the exhibition. The end result is a look at the two key government investigations the Warren Commission in '64 that concluded Oswald acted alone, no evidence of a conspiracy. And then the second, the congressional investigation in the '70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which did very controversially conclude that there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll who fired a fourth shot that missed. That was based on some controversial acoustics evidence that I won't get into today. We conclude the exhibit with this question, who was behind it? What do you believe? We don't take a position. We're very careful to navigate that and try to provide our audiences with the tools they need to make their own determinations. We do have a big panel which is worthy of expansion and further exploration, simply called Conspiracy. And it very quickly, just in paragraph form, documents some of the key conspiracy theories like organized crime, Cuba, the Soviet Union, the FBI, the CIA, those usual suspects that you find most often implicated in books and documentaries about the assassination. As far as how we deal with it on an ongoing basis, I mean, we do try to stay balanced. If you go to our YouTube channel, you will find a wealth of programming, far more than you could probably ever digest about the Kennedy assassination. And you'll find, I mean, it's a mix. We have eyewitnesses, police officers. In fact, some of the people whose voices were featured in this presentation today, you can go on there and actually hear and see them speak in their own voices as part of our Living History series. But we also have researchers and authors on both sides. We have a great program with Dr. Cyril Wecht, who's a pretty prominent conspiracy researcher, where he details his theory about the assassination. And then we have others who speak to the possibility of Oswald acting alone. Our museum store is the same way. If you go to our online bookstore, you'll find a mix of both lone gunman literature and assassination conspiracy literature. So we really try to provide all sides of the story for anyone who's interested.
We will wrap up with one last question and bring it forward to today. So how are the lessons learned at the Sixth Floor Museum still relevant today? And how have your education programs evolved to stay current, especially with today's political division?
Yeah, that's something that we think about on a daily basis here, trying to be as diverse as possible in our storytelling, to be as inclusive as we can with the exhibits that we create. I mean, it goes from just trying to seek out more minority voices for the Oral History Project to translating all of our exhibit text into Spanish so that we can reach a broader audience in that respect. We certainly do try to use the legacy of President Kennedy to further explore the history and culture of the 1960s. And that extends to the civil rights movement, as well as arts and culture, space and technology, which is it's a great way of bringing the Kennedy legacy right up to the present day, talking about how technology that he advocated with the space program in the early 60s, we now hold in our hands with, tablets and iPhones. We lose sight of the fact that if it wasn't for the innovations made by NASA and other organizations, including Texas Instruments here in Dallas, during that space race, when we were actively trying to fulfill Kennedy's pledge of landing a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. So this real race to get us there, the technology developed during that time, I mean, we still use in our daily lives every day. And so the Kennedy legacy, I mean, is fruitful, and it allows us this broad exploration of a wide variety of diverse topics and dynamic storytellers as we try to tell a broader, richer, more inclusive picture of the time period and the ways in which it still touches our visitors' lives today.
Stephen, thank you so much for hosting us. This has been a real treat, and we've enjoyed hearing from you and the wealth of information that you have to share. So thank you so much for your time and for all of your energy that you put into our presentation today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And our website, jfk.org, has a lot more information about both the museum and the assassination, including several hundred artifacts you can visit in our online collections database.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. And thank you to everyone who attended today or is watching this. Please stay tuned and follow our Facebook page, as we will have future visits and live virtual tours, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much, everyone.